Dr. Michael Oren is perhaps best known as Israel's former ambassador to the Middle East and an Israeli parliament member. But before that, he was a historian and best-selling author of nonfiction, writing on the Six-Day War, America's involvement in the Middle East, and an account of his diplomatic service in Washington. But Oren's latest book is a distinct change of pace, a collection of short stories called The Night Archer. And while it's fiction, he's drawn inspiration from his own dramatic life, as we could see here.
There are over 50 short stories in this book, and each one is completely different. I was Israel's ambassador to Washington, and there are stories about diplomacy, stories about social climbing in America's capital. I worked in Hollywood. I was Orson Welles' assistant. And so there's stories about Hollywood. I was a soldier. There's stories about war. I'm a father, a son. There's stories about parenthood. There's stories about childhood. And of course, there's stories about love.
And joining us from Tel Aviv is Dr. Michael Oren. Michael, now I know that you've written fiction before. You've even published it under a pseudonym. But what made you now to come out of the closet, so to speak, as a fiction writer?
There's no pseudonyms. I've always been Michael Oren, I tell you. But I haven't published fiction in a very long time. I haven't really published a book in a long time because I've been serving in the Israeli government. And by law, if you are in the government, you cannot publish books. You can write books. And these 51 stories were written early in the morning before I went off to Knesset or before I went off to the Prime Minister's office. And they were ready to go when I left office last May.
Right. Now, as you described in that little clip, some of them you say are drawn from your own very considerable life experiences. Some of them which I wasn't aware of, working for Orson Welles. I mean, just tell us a little about some of the specifics of that. Where do you pick on, and how do you transmute that into fiction?
Well, it's my experience growing up as a Jewish kid in a non-Jewish neighborhood, encountering anti-Semitism. My experience as the son of a World War II veteran who had encountered the Holocaust in Europe. That had a big impact on me. The experience of being in Washington and encountering phenomena that are not well known outside of that world. The phenomena, for example, of social climbers, people who pay assistants and advisors so they can get to better and better better and better parties, and ultimately maybe get to dinner at the White House. There are ghost stories. There are historical stories, stories set in the 16th century, stories set in the 15th century, in the 1940s and the 1950s, et cetera. It's, for me, writing is the ultimate liberation, Calev. It's freedom. I could be anywhere or any place I want to be. And it is tremendously, tremendously liberating.
Right. Now, you actually are not either the first Israeli diplomat or the first Israeli member of Knesset to write fiction. Actually, some very well-known writers served for example, in the Knesset. But how do you feel when you've told people and you discuss, and you said your new book is coming out, people might be expecting it to be another tome on Israel-U.S. diplomacy or Mideast diplomacy. I mean, what has been the reaction of accepting you as a fiction writer?
Very good. And people are pleasantly surprised. I think that, many of them haven't read my previous fiction, so it comes maybe a little bit of a shock for them until they actually read the stories. Because they are so different, because they take the reader to different places. They're very short, Calev. Most of them, some of them are only 1 or 2 pages. And if you're Corona bound and in the house and you've run out of Netflix films to stream, this is the book for you. It'll keep you entertained, and it is in fact a journey.
Right. I have to ask you, what did you do in Hollywood, and how did that become a story? I was completely unaware of your association with the great director Orson Welles.
Well, when I was 17, I made a film, a World War I film, that won the #1 prize in the National Young Filmmakers Contest from PBS. So obviously, I had to go to Hollywood at some point. And I went to Hollywood, and one day I was crossing Hollywood and Vine. You almost can't make up the story. I overheard a director and a producer discussing a scene. I turned to them and said, "How would you like to have a bright, young East Coast college kids work on your set?" They said, "Sure." And it turned out that they were making commercials with Orson Welles. Now, I don't know how old you are, Calev, but some of us remember the Paul Masson wine commercials, "No wine before it's time," with Orson Welles. I held the cue cards for that commercial.
Yeah, I'm that old, Michael. I am impressed.
Not that old. But I had the Zionist dream of moving to Israel, and I was getting older, and I wanted to be in the paratroopers and the Sanchanim. So I came to Israel. I served in the paratroopers and never left.
Right, and I'm sure that's reflected in the pages of your book. Let me ask you about something else. Your last book, Ally, about your time as the Israeli ambassador to the United States, did generate some controversy, did generate some criticism from your depiction of the Obama White House. Is there anything in this book maybe written about Washington, maybe written in different pseudonyms, or, I mean, in other words, characters that maybe some people are going to recognize and may also stir up some controversy?
Nothing political. I do write about the Washington political culture, and I write about the Israeli political culture. I have one character who's an Israeli politician, could be recognizable, I won't say who it is, who is being challenged both morally and politically, as well as by his mother and his past. That's based on a diplomatic trip I undertook to Lithuania. And while there, the foreign ministry of Lithuania took me on a trip to visit the shtetl, the small village from which my grandparents came. And that deeply impacted me, and I wrote the story after that. But no, there is one story I think that people will recognize, a literary figure who a good guest, an educated guest, will identify as Philip Roth.
As based on a personal experience that you had with him?
I'd like to say I sat around and schmoozed with Philip Roth. Alas, I did not, but I've read every one of his books, most of them more than once. But I also grew up on the skirts of his community. Outside of Waquaik, Newark, my father ran a Jewish hospital, which appears in literally every single Philip Roth novel. And Philip Roth's books can all be basically summarized into the phrase "Paradise Lost." Paradise being the Waquaik section of Newark, 1949 to 1955. That was paradise. And the story asked the question: what happens if this writer dies and actually awakens in this paradise? Is it truly heaven, or is it perhaps hell?
All right. Well, if you didn't call him Philip Roth, you're showing a lot more discretion about him than the real Philip Roth ever did about writing about himself. But that was his style.
So maybe it's hell.
Indeed.
So maybe it's hell.
Maybe. Dr. Michael Oren, thank you for joining us on The Rundown.
Thank you, Calev. Be well. Thank you.